So sometime last year I did a tutorial on how to create custom watercolor brushes in Procreate. The link for that is down below. And part of that includes using various textures to get kind of the feel of the brush that you want. And I did have a few questions about how to get the textures actually into the Procreate program. And I thought it was actually a really good idea to record a tutorial on how I source various textures and then how I import them into Procreate. So let's start off with sourcing. There are a bunch of different ways that you can get textures from either online or just out in the world. And I'm going to just start from what's probably the easiest, which is just finding free textures online. You can do this a number of different ways. Of course, an artist's best friend right now is Pinterest. So if you go to Pinterest, you can look up various textures. Watercolor paper textures, either hot press or cold press, is a place that is easy to start if you're doing watercolor style textures or paintings. But for the use of creating brushes, it's actually interesting or fun to go outside of the box and think of other textures that can be used. So if you like a really rough grain or kind of like dirty brush look, then you can use things like rusted metal, stucco, concrete, even asphalt, like from the road. And you can input any of those words with the word texture into Pinterest to look up various pictures that other people have taken of those textures. As long as those are free to use, you can then download them and import them to Procreate, which is a step that I'll get to in just a second. Another resource for finding free textures is DeviantArt. I know that DeviantArt isn't as widely used anymore, but I am old school and I've been using DeviantArt for many years now. So you can actually go to DeviantArt, and a lot of other artists have uploaded various images and textures and things like that that they allow you to use for free. Finally, there are free stock photo websites like Pexels, that's PEXELS.com, and Pixabay. And there are actually a few other ones that I can't think of right now. I will include links to a few other free stock photo resources in the description box below. But all of those websites, again, they have free options for you to use. Some of them have stipulations that it can't be used for commercial work, or you do have to attribute them. So just make sure that you read the stipulations that they include with the image that they upload. And another option, of course, for finding texture resources online is to pay for them. There are paid stock photo websites like Adobe Stock and iStock and other options of the sort. There's also artists who have texture bundles that they will sell on either Gumroad or Etsy or even Patreon. So those are options that you can explore as well. I don't typically purchase textures for Procreate just because there's so many free options, and also I prefer a lot of the times to use my own custom images that I use for texture. So that brings me to how to get your own custom textures. So as I mentioned, the easiest place to start for custom textures is paper. I have various watercolor pads, and some are cold press paper, some are hot press paper. Each one of them has a slightly different texture or a slightly different grain to it, and that will create different effects or different looks in your final painting. So in the brush that you create, or even if you're just using it as a paper texture in the Procreate program, everything will kind of create a slightly different feel. If you like a subtler, more smooth, just slightly textured look, then you're probably going to want to go with something like a low cold press texture, or even just a hot press texture. Sometimes even marker paper that is made specifically for like Copic markers or just alcohol ink markers, has a very slight texture to it, and that can create a smoother look if you want just a little tiny bit of texture. If you're like me and you're kind of obsessed with texture, then you can go with like a heavy duty cold press watercolor paper, or even branch out into, as I mentioned before, things like stucco and concrete and asphalt and rusty metal. Those are things that you don't really think about sometimes as texture for art, but they actually do create really wonderful looks, especially when they're used in custom brushes. So as an example, this is a picture of one of my walls in my house. And this is a picture of the carpet in my living room. This is a picture of the wood flooring, so the wood grain in some of the other parts of my house. This is a picture of rusted metal that I found just out on one of the piers here. And this is a picture of a sidewalk, so just concrete. And this is a picture of the road in front of my house. All of these pictures were taken using my phone, just setting my phone to take ultra high def pictures and with the flash off, because the flash does sometimes blow out the texture and you can't really make it out. So those are super easy to just walk around and find and take pictures of. But once you have the pictures into your phone or into your iPad, the next step is to get them into Procreate. So what I do, if I have the pictures on my phone, because I have an Android phone and iPad runs on Mac, I actually have to use an intermediary step, which is I upload it to Dropbox. Once I have the photo into Dropbox, then I can use Dropbox on my iPad to download the photo and go from there to create the texture that I want. So once I have it downloaded to my iPad, I have it saved in my photo gallery, then I'm going to open Procreate and I'm going to click on Photo instead of creating a new canvas. I'm going to select the photo that I want to use, and I do this step with every texture that I want to use, whether I downloaded it from the internet or even if it's already a watercolor paper texture. I still do this step because there are a few edits and tweaks that I want to make. So I have the photo open, and the first thing I'm going to do is change it to grayscale. So I'm going to go up here and I'm going to click on the hue saturation editor, and I'm going to bring the saturation all the way down. The next thing that I'm going to do is adjust the curves very slightly. I almost always have a few changes that I want to make to how the texture looks. Either it's a little bit too intense, or it, more often than not, it doesn't really have a difference between like the darkest point and the lightest point. So I want to adjust the curves to kind of up the contrast of the darkest point and the lightest point, and that kind of gives the texture a little extra oomph. Especially when you're using these for brushes, you kind of have to be a little bit heavy-handed with the texture because that's the only way that it's going to show through in the final brush. So now I have, finally, the image that I want to use. So I'm going to go ahead and save this as a JPEG. And then I'm going to close it out. And again, I do this with every single image that I want to use as a texture. So now I am going to create a new canvas to show you how to use it as a paper texture. So I have a new canvas now. This is just blank, it's plain white. And I am going to go up here and click Insert Photo. And then I'm going to set that photo to multiply. And quite often I have to change the opacity. I usually lower it to somewhere between like 80 and 90%. And then underneath this as a multiply layer, I will create a new layer, and then I can begin painting. And what that will do is apply the texture of this image to everything that I paint. So I do this quite often with watercolor papers. So everything that I paint underneath this layer will have that, will look like it is on or resting on a watercolor paper. So that's the super simple way to create it as a paper. Now to use it as a brush texture, you do have to do a couple extra steps. First, I'm going to go up here and use just the round brush, and I'm going to duplicate it. That way I have just kind of a base starting point for a brush. Then I am going to double click on the brush to start editing it. And there are a lot of different things that you can do to create kind of the watercolor brush effect, and I did go over that in a previous video, so I'm not going to go over that again. But to apply a texture to the brush specifically, you're going to want to go to grain. And once you're in grain, you're going to want to click on grain source and then click on import. You can then import the photo just as you did as a paper texture. Then click on done. And just very quickly, I'm going to show And you can make changes here to the scale of the grain, whether it moves with the brush or stays static. You can do changes like depth and depth jitter, things like that. There's a lot of different things that you can do with the grain to kind of create different effects. Again, I did cover a lot of that in my previous video, so I won't go over it all again. I'm just going to use it as is and just give you a very brief view of what it looks like. So let me go ahead and start painting with it. You can see that right away, even without it making any changes to the brush shape or jitter or anything like that, it changes how the brush looks when I paint with it. So you can see that there's kind of limitless possibilities for what you can do with the textures that you can import as for custom brushes or even for just custom papers. So that was a very quick and simple tutorial for how to get custom textures into Procreate. And I hope that that answers some of the questions that I got for this process. If you have any other questions or suggestions, please leave them in the comment section below. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.